Hi everybody! Because we're all sitting at home right now, I've decided to start doing art lessons. I already did my introduction to drawing video, and if you're new to this video, I highly recommend just giving that one a quick watch, even if you're confident with your art skills. I do have a less conventional approach to how I draw, and so I want you to understand that method before we move on to this one right here. Today we're going to be doing a black and white realism piece, and you know, the jump from last video to this video might seem dramatic, but I promise you that all those same concepts are going to apply. I just needed to introduce that mindset before we actually get to the drawing portion. So go ahead and give that one a watch. I'm really excited to be working with you guys today. I hope this helps some people realize their potential. I mentioned I would pick an eye as the subject, and everybody seemed to be down for that, and so here's the picture of the eye. I'm going to show it on screen that I'm using as a reference. Use whatever eye as a reference as you want. Just make sure that it's when you search on Google for an eye, make sure that you're using the large filter, and then pick a image that's in color, because next week we're going to do this same exact eye but with color pencil, and for that one you're going to need a soft core color pencil set. I use Prismacolor. I stand by them. I think they're great, and a lot of art stores are doing sales right now because of what's going on. And then I'm also going to be using toned tan paper, and there's a couple of different brands that you can get, but I also recommend getting that. You can also use tone gray. The difference is only slight. I just choose tone tan because it's closer to skin tone, so it'll make a more appealing image at the end of it. Enough for the introduction. We're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to have my phone, my eye reference, next to me. I'm going to keep it on screen as another image, but just letting you know that when you have your reference image next to you, keep the photo the same size. So if I want to draw it this big, I'm going to, on the paper, I'm going to keep it that big on my phone, because as soon as you start zooming in or zooming out, the spatial concept becomes skewed, and so we want to keep it the same size. If you can't see the tiny little detail here if you're drawing at this size, then you don't need to see it, because even if you draw that won't show up anyways if you can't already see it to the naked eye. So just go ahead and keep it this size. We're going to use this reference, and let's get started. I mentioned before that I usually start with the tear duct, and so I'm going to do that here. See, make sure I do this high enough. And so we're going to take that same concept that we learned last video. We're going to start by just the little curve of the tear duct, and everybody can draw lines, and so we're just going to start, and it's going to look very similar. You'll see now why I did this in my first video, that little curve shape, because that's the first shape that we're going to be using. And so you want to just be looking constantly at your reference photo and what you're doing with your pen. If you notice that your little curve was wider than the tear duct in the photo, then narrow it. Each little step should be done very carefully. And so what a lot of people would assume you would do is do the entire outline of the eye, with all your lines, and then start shading it. Personally, that's not how I draw, and that's why I suggest watching the other video first. I draw by doing it each little bit at a time. So I'm using a mechanical pencil for this entire video. If you have a pencil set with different weights to it, 8B or 3B, and you want to really create contrast in that way, go for it. But I want this to be an accessible video and one that everyone feels like they can tackle, so I'm going to use a mechanical pencil, because a lot of people will have a pencil, but they might not have a full pencil set. For next week, though, we want everyone to be able to at least get your basic soft core color pencil set. Okay, and so that's as far as the shape that I'm going to create with just the lines right now, because now we're going to take that, if you see that black gradient, or that, pretty pitch black shape in this photo's tear duct, a lot of the photos that you see will probably have it a little bit lighter, but the contrast is pretty high in the photo I'm using. But I'm going to draw it as exactly as I see it, and that's what I want everyone to do. Don't fill in the blanks in your head, just use your eyes and translate it using your hands. So I see there's a little bit of darkness here, so I'm going to go ahead and start shading that. There's a couple very slight gradients, and for those of you who really struggle with the idea of the hand-eye coordination and the shading, an exercise that you can do, I'll flip to really quick, just to teach your hand how to use better control. I used to like do these in class all the time. They're kind of like little tornadoes. And I would adjust my pressure as I went down. And I would just do these sorts of shapes and really have fun with it over and over. You see how like pretty wide those shade marks are? You can practice doing them even wider, depending, like some people like to hatch, some people like to cross hatch. I'm going to be trying to do a smooth gradient on the picture we're doing now, so you could even go even slower and even smoother, and it'll just teach your hand. I like to move it around so I can really practice the pressure while I'm changing the shape, which is a good thing to do. You can go from dark to light and then back to dark, and that'll just give you that, you know, hand-eye coordination. When it comes to doing realism, I don't think that, you know, obviously you want this sort of basic skill set, but you can also, I was once told that using a smudge stick is, you know, not the proper way to do things. For what I'm teaching you, go ahead and do that. Honestly, I just want you to be proud of what you're making, and it doesn't matter how you get to that method, and nobody should deter you from doing it the way that's comfortable for you. Okay, so we're going to keep on. And so when I said last time that the lines that you create are just little by little and you can see it so you can draw it, the same is going to apply here, even when it comes to blocking out shading. So if you'll notice, this tear duct has kind of like a, on my photo, has like a hard slanted line, and then it's like a little shine here and a little shine here, and you can kind of block it out super lightly with a pencil like I'm doing, and then that'll help you know where to stop so you don't accidentally shade too far. You always have an eraser with pencil, so you know, don't stress too much if you find that your proportions are a little off and you want to adjust things. When we get to color pencil, that's going to change a little bit, but it's closer with the softcore color pencil and the technique that I'm going to show you. It's going to be a little closer to painting, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Okay, and so we're going to keep, and here's the thing about this method. People will start to look at it and be like, what are you even doing? That doesn't look good. You don't trust the process. You think the little detailers are weird right now. But I promise you, as it becomes an entire image, you'll realize that it's just something about taking your time and trusting the process. This is why I do it this way, though, because if I were to draw the outline on the whole eye, when you don't have the shading there for dimension, sometimes things look flat and they don't look like the image you're referencing, so you might be discouraged. I personally really like this method of doing realism because every step of the way, now that I've been doing this for so long, I can see that it's going to turn out to be a very completed and realistic looking image by the time we're done. I'm going to keep shading, and I might speed through some parts of this, obviously, just while I'm shading along. I kind of want to just give you the initial idea of what we're doing, because we're going to be doing this throughout the entire video. You can see this tear duct starting to take shape. You know, when I'm done with this, I might take a pen, and those really, really black areas that I won't be able to get with this graphite, I might even go in with a pen and just touch in those little bit of black areas. But, you know, that's something that's safe for the last part of this. It's not necessary. I'm just going to do it because I like mixed media. I want to flip back to show you another point about how other people would draw eyes and why I think it's important to watch my first video, because, you know, you'll see a lot of people, you know, talk about doing the entire eyeball and then the iris and the pupil and then the almond shape. And again, these are kinds of tricks that would be really useful if you're just drawing something from your head. I still tend to use photo references, even if I'm making up an image of my own, just to make sure I'm like being anatomically correct. But people would say, you know, the tear duct is obviously outside the eyeball, and so it would be kind of in that almond shape, and then you have your lid, and your eyebrow tends to fall on top of the eyeball. And, you know, there's nothing, this is, again, good for character creation, but when people start by drawing this way, they're really disappointed because what they're drawing doesn't look like what they want it to draw, which is why we're going to be doing things this way. So just to reinforce, you know, that I know that this isn't the most conventional thing. Anytime you draw a drawing book, you know, they'll have like 4 steps, like the circles, the shape, and then like a little bit of dimension and shading, and then bam, it's like this crazy cool drawing, and people don't know how they got from A, B, C to D. So this will kind of help you with my method and to see how my brain works for art, and I think everybody's does work differently, but I hope this helps people who felt otherwise stagnant. And again, I'm just shading as I see it. This is all about using hand pressure, so this is nothing fancy. You'll see that it's just dark fill here. I didn't fill it in there. It's just slightly lighter here. It's just looking at the image, referencing it as closely as I can, and then applying it to the drawing. If you take it as slowly as you need to and you really focus and don't move on until you're really sure about what you've drawn and the details that you've put in there, then it'll come out great. So just take your time. I'm going to leave another space for that shine. And you know, when we get to color pencil, if we use toned tan paper, what's great is when you add the white to the tan paper, it really pops. And so you're going to have a lot of fun with that. I'm really excited to show everyone, because that's really when you surprise yourself. But this is, I also do love using pencil, and I think it's a great foundation to start with. It's a great way to learn hand-eye coordination. Make sure you don't move on until you're pretty sure that this looks like the tear duct in the photo. And again, when you get to this, you're like, wow, I don't really feel like I'm like, what is this? It doesn't look great. You might get discouraged. Please don't. You're going to be really excited by the time we're done. So we're going to move on. And if you watch the first video, you know that I think that these little lines that we're creating is accessible to everybody, and if you just practice looking at lines and repeating them and drawing them, this will feel a lot easier to you by the time we're getting to this lesson. And that's why I'm encouraging everyone to start there. Okay, so I built out a little bit more. I'm always checking to make sure these distances look relatively the same. You can use your pencil and measure it with your reference photo to see if you're on the right track. But that's what the shading does too. So before we keep moving on and doing the whole thing, that's why we're going to keep using shading, because it's a pretty good indicator if your measurements are correct. This is why when you're referencing a color image, though, you should put it in black and white, because those things become less obvious if you're taking a color photo and doing a pencil drawing of it, thinking that turning something into grayscale is easy, because it really can fluctuate based on, what colors are being made darker or not. For instance, if you make something black and white in Photoshop, you can make all the red values darker, all the yellow values brighter, you can add more contrast. So really make sure the black and white image that you've created is one that you think is visually stunning before you even get to this, because we're not changing any of those values, we're just copying them as we see them. Okay. And so I noticed there's like a little light vein here in my reference of photo. And like I said before, you don't need to use the same reference photo. Actually, I would even encourage you to use a different one, because I don't want you comparing what you're doing to me. I think everyone can achieve exactly what I'm doing, but you start wondering, looking at the photo and looking at what I'm doing, like, oh, she did that differently. I'm using my critical eye and choosing what details to add right now and what to subtract. But you could even go a step further. I could really take this, spend like 7 hours on it and go crazy with it. But right now I'm just doing a general understanding values, just going along as I see it. I highly recommend spending as much time on it as you can, and really becoming self-disciplined and really making sure you get all the minute details. But for the sake of doing this video and finishing the instruction, I'm going kind of at my own pace, which obviously I've been doing this for, a couple decades now, so it comes a little bit quicker to me. But everybody moves at their own pace, and that's okay. And practice. You will become faster the more that you draw. So again, I'm widening that space as I'm seeing it. Just taking it little by little, making sure that this isn't too narrow, that this is looking at the photo and looking at this, that this all feels proportionate. I'm noticing that this value could be a little darker over here. So going in and just make those little changes as I go, just by looking from one to the other. Even some of this is probably still a little too bright and too light. But it's better, honestly, to have a lot of contrast in the image, and then by the end you'll look at it and decide, okay, this all could be a little bit darker, But right now I'm just going along and doing it as close to what I'm looking at as possible. So at the end of this little vein, I'm seeing all these like shine marks. And like I said before, you can very, very light, like barely touching the page. You probably won't even see it in this video, but I'm like blocking out very lightly where the shine is going to be. So that I don't accidentally shade in that area when I don't want it there. Go ahead and make this darker on the bottom. And then there's that little like bright white water line that's happening. So I'm going to leave a space for that as well. And I'm going to speed through some of these things because we're just going to take that same idea all the way up until the iris. So I promise that this isn't as complicated as it looks. If you compare it to the reference image, and this one's a little closer to the screen. I'm going to have it obviously on screen. I'm just showing you what I'm looking at as I'm drawing. As you can see, this shape is really accurate to this shape, and if you look at those shapes and you see like the, you know, is this portion from here to here the same as the one that's in the photo? If they feel different, like if these points curve too much in, or this is like really thin whereas the photo was like very wider, don't keep drawing because the rest of the image is going to start to look, you know, distorted and not how you want it to look. So really harness this first initial shape because everything else is going to be built off of it, including the iris, because if this shape isn't right, you'll notice when you finish it on the other side that it's not going to look like a circle, and so that much will be clear. So I'm going to go ahead and create that definitive shape right there. I'm going to have my shine over here. And I notice on this side of the iris from my photo reference that it's, you know, got a pretty, you know, medium tone over here, and that this water line is down here. I started by doing pencil drawings like most people, and then I moved on to using like cross-hatching and ink, and then it wasn't till much later that I did color pencil. I will say that, you know, if you follow my work, you'll notice that color pencil is truly my favorite medium for drawing, and I think it's because it is such a dynamic medium. There's so many different color options, and you'll really surprise yourself with the realism. And so I'm really excited to show everyone that. But I wanted to give you time to be able to get the color pencils before we move on. And also, this is a really great thing to practice. Contrast is very important when it comes to drawing. Even in color pencil, you'll notice that, you know, if you're not adding your darks and your highlights in as dark and as bright as possible, then the whole image is going to come out to be this kind of like flat gray looking instead of having like dark blacks and bright whites. So we're going to make, this is a great way to reinforce that. Okay, so we're going to, the edge of the iris is, you know, again, one of those very dark areas. On my photo, because of the shine that's over here, it almost looks like not perfectly round, like there's this kind of like indent right over here, and that's using your critical eye. You could very well just make that totally round, but again, if you make those micro adjustments on your own as we're copying an image, your whole image is going to end up being like a little bit off, and that comes from, you know, either getting lazy with the details or moving past them and being like, well, that's good enough, because it's better to only get this much done and then to get back to it later or come back to it a different day than to rush through the entire thing, not be happy with your drawing, because then you've just spent this entire time doing something that you don't love. So I want you to love what you're doing. Okay, so before I go too far in this direction, you know, this isn't the only part of the eye that we're going to be doing, so I don't like to move completely over until I've finished from a section. It's just good to have this as the framework for the lids. So we're going to go back to where the tear duct is, and we're kind of going to, some of these lines are more shading than they are line works, but for the sake of, you know, showing you that it's all just at the end of the day using that, you know, critical eye and looking at the lines that are on the paper, judging distance. So this distance from here to here, a lot of people would draw this line closer in because they're not accounting for the shading that's happening right here. So that's why we only do a small portion at a time, and then we take our pencil and we shade in that area before we move on, because that's going to give you a more accurate idea of what to draw next. And it's pretty dark in this area for the reference image I'm using. a little bit further up. Around this point, like you can see in the photo, those eyelashes start. And so, you know, again, a lot of people would, I'm going to flip back, would do their lines, even with this method that I'm showing you, where you would do the lid like we're doing and shading it. They would shade the whole thing without the eyelashes and then go back in and then do those. I don't like to do things that way because I'd rather get each section as accurate as possible before I move on. So the eyelashes start right about here, and just like you do everything else, don't just draw a bunch of random lines. Look at the ones in the photo and copy them as you see them. You know, if you don't need to know how eyelashes work, as long as what you're looking at, you're just drawing it as you see it. There are tricks, you know, when you're drawing from your head, that you know, like the direction that eyelashes go and how they curve out and forward, but we're using a reference image, so you don't need to know all that right now. Okay, and so the line that's on this eyelid, like I said, it's more shading until it gets to right about here, and then the crease becomes a lot darker. And then we're going to go back on this side and do the same thing, because again, I don't like to move on very far until I get one section done. And that's if you look at any of my realism pieces, this is exactly how I do it, whether it's color pencil or not. I just pick an area and I start working that area, just little by little. This is one of those cool little details, these reflection of the eyelashes, and is one of those things that, you know, if you're drawing it all very quickly, that you might miss this detail if you're not doing it in this way, like this method of like taking it one step at a time. But this is one of those details that's really going to stand out to you. Again, it might not look right yet, but once you see it in the reflection and have all the other values next to it, it's just really going to impress you. So I recommend, you know, that's why we're doing it this way, and that's why we're taking it super slow. You can really start, I think the iris is a great indication of like when you actually start to see the picture coming together. And like I said before, when you do it this way, you know, it doesn't, when you have an iris and you do the pupil and you don't have the shines in yet, but you're kind of using that sort of method, it really doesn't feel like an eyeball at that point. Even if you add like some shine and some shading, you're not going to be like super proud or impressed with what you're doing if you do things quickly and using, like, filling in the blanks yourself instead of like using your reference image. So this is just another reason why this is how people get to this point, at least in my opinion, and what worked for me is just by taking things like one little step at a time. I'm going quicker probably than I normally would for a lot of this, just for the instructional sake of the video, but really feel free to pause and just take things as slowly. Watch the video even and not be drawing along to it. Take in the information and then apply it yourself. And it's always good to, you know, make sure you're checking your values. Like, I'll notice that this is a lot darker down here, so I'm going back and I'm really improving those areas as I go along. This is one of those moments where like using your critical eye is going to be really important, because as you'll see, this isn't a perfectly round iris. There's this curvature here. This is a really wide outer line. The pupil doesn't sit perfectly in the center of all this, so using this method, like seeing that the pupil starts at the end of the shine, almost like this line through it is part of the iris, is really important to placing that correctly. Even if it doesn't feel right, just trust your eyes. So as I drew that, you know, using my critical eye, I would say that the top of that it's way too much of an oval, even though it's not a perfectly round circle. I can see that this needs to be lowered a little bit. And, you know, once I'm happy and confident with that eye shape, or that pupil shape rather, I would, you know, fill that in very dark, which I pretty much am. I just want to make sure that line is not too wide on the outside. Cool. So here's the point in the photo too where you're really going to start to see your hard work pay off. You're like, oh, okay, cool. I'm actually seeing how this is going to look like a, you know, more realistic, detailed version of an eye. And again, I might go in with ink to make these points like even darker than they are. Everything that I'm teaching you here is a reflection of how I draw. Again, this isn't, everyone's going to have a different approach. I don't think anyone's form of expression could be considered wrong. But if we're following my approach, I'm going to tell you what you need to do to be able to create images like I create them. And that's the whole point of this. You're not wrong in what you're doing. Your art has been fantastic up until this point, but I'm just giving you an insight and a, look into how I do it differently. I noticed that some of my fuzzy lashes, using my critical eye, I noticed that some of the fuzzy lashes I did over here were actually over here. And so, because I want to reinforce that everybody should have this mentality of not, just accepting it as is, it doesn't hurt to just erase that little part and to use my eye to move that first fuzzy lash, out of focus lashes, kind of aligned with the edge of this iris. And that would have, messed with all my other lashes if they were all offset. So this is why it's important, if you notice something, to go back and to reassess and, fix it. There's that pretty bright waterline, so being able to take the edge of my eraser just to make sure that that stands out, and then I can do that darker line underneath it that we see. I really don't want anyone who's doing this stuff, for me, I'm trying to do this in the quickest way possible while still giving detailed instruction, but really take your time on all your points of shading. If you really focus on the minute details and nuances of the tone, you'll notice that no one section is just one flat color. Like the part that I'm doing right now, there's an additional kind of wrinkly area that comes up in here, and there's another line that comes up in here, and just using those little details and trying to make those stand out, because that's what's really going to give you an incredible image. As you go, doing it a millimeter at a time, I promise you that your image will be probably better than mine at this point, because you'll really be focusing on those small parts. It's these tiny, really cool little details that are in the iris that are the most fun to draw for me personally. So I always have a lot of fun spending time on these things. This value is way, way, way darker in the image that I'm looking at. So that's really going to give you that illusion that the, top lid is creating shadow on the iris. So that's why paying attention to the details and taking things slow is really important, because, it's a big part. I would say out of everything that you do, really focusing on your blackest blacks and your whitest whites while you're drawing is going to make all the difference in the world for what you're doing. Man, is that necessary? Are these little hairs, they look so weird already, but once you see the image as a whole, it won't feel that way. And even when, if you're drawing, I have, the color pencil eye that I did, those little pores in it, those felt weird drawing them, but as you, look at the image as a whole, it doesn't feel so strange. So that will apply here. There definitely will be some moments where you're is this, this little, little black mark that I'm making, is that going to make a difference? I promise you it is. Do everything as you're seeing it. Take it slow. Keep in mind that this is going to apply for whether it's an eye or an entire face. This concept is the same no matter what you're drawing. So it doesn't change. There's nothing that's more difficult than something else. There are some things that are more difficult if you're, building them out in that, in this sort of way. Doing a hand would be more difficult because you have, even weirder shapes that are more complicated, and you have, weird finger, joints to draw, and, but doing it this way, everything is exactly the same, and that's why I love to start here, and that's why I love to show people that they have the ability to do this, because you just need that confidence to realize that this is not the hardest thing. If anything, coming up with stuff from your head and putting it on paper is really difficult. This is not hard. Everybody can do this. One of the important things, especially for young people out there, but also I know that a lot of people were discouraged from doing art, at some point probably. I was discouraged at one point. I had a guidance counselor in high school tell me that I should find more realistic goals. So, before somebody tells you that what you're doing isn't the proper method, just remember that, as long as your final image looks dope, who cares, honestly? It doesn't, no one's going to overanalyze how you got to that point. If anything, do things in the way that give you, like I said, it's smudging. If that gives you the best result for that gradient right there, then do that. You don't have to force yourself to do that with your hand if it makes more sense to take your finger. Just know that when you smudge something, you take away sometimes the brighter values, so just go back in with your eraser in some sections and recreate that highlight that you're seeing. This line that I'm drawing right here, that is not to reflect the outermost edge of the iris. That's to reflect, this lighter inside of the iris that I see. And sometimes, and that's what I mean by taking it step by step, because if you try to do the outer edge first instead of the closer section first, like that's also why I did this and then judged it on this distance, you probably will be off because, the shading will make the distances look longer or shorter, and that's why we take it slowly as we build out, because those things become more obvious if you take it like one section at a time. But if you start by doing all this line work first, chances are your proportions are going to be off. It's just like, at least for me, and I've been doing this for so long, this has always provided a better result for me. So now I'm doing that thicker edge that I was talking about, and I will get a more accurate representation of the full iris by taking it slowly like this, because if I did just do a circle, it would have looked off because this iris is not a perfect circle. And if you notice in the photo that I'm using too, this is not a hard line in the photo. It kind of like fades out very softly and like very short. It's not like a long gradient, it's a short gradient. And that's just using my eye. Again, everybody's capable of doing this if you're just looking at it with the critical eye. And even on this side of the eye, the whites of the eye are actually pretty dark because of the shadow. So, this is one of those things, again, like staying true to what you're looking at and not just basing it on what you think the eye should look like based on, in your head when you picture an eye, the whites of the eye are probably white in your mind when you visualize it, but that's not the case when you have different lighting. And again, it's when we get to these like shapes that I really start paying attention personally, because I'll notice, that this is going to complete that inner, portion of the eye, and you want that to be as accurate as possible. The point, if I were to finish it where I am now, like it's probably about as long as it needs to be, but this is not as like thin, like the end of it's pretty wide, so clearly, it has to come together to more of a point. Not quite a point, but just a smaller edge. And that's one of those things, just maintaining that critical eye. And, as we're shading as we go, this is one of those moments that might feel weird because nothing around it is darker either, so it doesn't look natural until, you get the rest of the shading here and here to really show that there's shadow over there. And so that's why, doing things as you go along in small sections is gonna, give you a better idea of what the image actually is instead of you filling in the blanks for how you think they should be. Whenever I do eyes, it always, whenever I'm teaching somebody I draw and I start with the eye, it always surprises them how long the lower lashes are, and this is why trusting yourself and just looking at what you see and copying it is so important, because most people would not draw this many lower lashes if they were drawing it from their head, nor would they draw them this long in some of these areas, but truth be told, they're usually a lot longer than you think they are. The skin all around the eye, except with the exception of here, here, and here, would be darker, so you could very well go through and just to give yourself that little bit more of that illusion. I'm always going to go back, reassess those areas that could be darker or it could be brighter, and adjust those once I see the full image. Because even though we're going slowly and taking things little by little, when it comes to shading, sometimes when you're so focused on the little details and just getting the lines correct and the spacing correct, you might not see the values as darkly or as brightly as you would if you were stepping back from it and comparing them side by side. And like I said, just for contrast's sake, I am going to go in and really darken And if you've created so much pencil mark that you can't get a bright white because you've erased too many times, this is one reason why taking things slow is good, because you will erase less and get less of that muddy erased look in there. But if you did have to erase in some portions of it, don't worry, just you can always use a paint marker in some of those areas, white out. Try to avoid it. I have a bunch of different sizes and all that, but really if you just have one of these sorts of markers or pens, that's going to be good enough to get you the values that you want. So I'm going in just in some of those areas where there was like true dark blacks and, playing around with that. There are things that I wouldn't recommend doing pen first because you'll want to micro adjust before you're happy with the overall image. Like you might have proportions that seem slightly off, and so you don't want to start doing pen until the very end, so that you can make those changes before they're permanent. It might not come intuitively to everyone that this could be, that element that's taking you, or that's stopping you rather from getting to that next level where you want to see, where you look at someone and you're like, how did they get all that contrast? What am I doing wrong? And not everybody when they post their art will say this is mixed media, like I use both. Some people will just pass it off as a pencil drawing. Like you never really know what someone's process is, so just find out what works for you and what makes you the most happy with your art, and then do that. The only thing that you would need to truly practice is your patience and your self-discipline, because you're already able to do exactly this. It's just how much time you're willing to put into just spending on those little details and not getting discouraged because it's not happening as fast as you'd like it to. So take that to heart. You can do it. I actually believe that. It's not a big secret. I hope that this video has been really helpful to those out there who felt like this is something that was outside their capability. Like I said, for the sake of doing the video, I wanted to, get a full eye done, but, you can always take it a step further. There are values here that could be done darker. There's highlights that could be brighter. Just take your time, have fun with it, put on some music. I tend to watch TV in the background when I'm drawing. We have all the time right now to really spend on learning new things, gaining new skill sets. I'm working out, I'm teaching myself how to do pull-ups. I'm in this boat with you guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Next time we're going to be doing this same picture but in color pencil, and if this is going to shock you with your abilities, just wait till we get to the color pencil. You're going to be able to do this right away, and it's going to surprise you. So subscribe to follow this series, and thanks for tuning in. You can follow me on Instagram at artistjodie Steele. See you next time.